Let's face it, the fantasy football season of 2016 for wide receivers was awful. While the fantasy football season last year was plagued with big running backs either getting injured or busting, wide receivers were a safe haven, with Antonio Brown being the most valuable fantasy football player last year. Fast forward to this year, and the opposite is true. In 2015, there were 13 wide receivers or tight ends who had 10 or more receiving touchdowns. Want to guess how many there were this year? 5. Odell Beckham, Mike Evans, Antonio Brown, Devontae Adams, and Jordy Nelson. The leader in receiving yards this year was T.Y. Hilton, with a total of 1,448 yards. If we take that yardage total and put it on the leaderboards of last year, it finishes in at 6th. While 2016 may have not contained a lot of wide receiver injuries, save Sammy Watkins and Keenan Allen, there were a surprising amount of busts, whether it was Allen Robinson, Brandon Marshall, or DeAndre Hopkins, mostly due to how terrible their quarterbacks performed. However, the saving grace of this season was the running back play. In 2K15, only 5 tailbacks were able to have 10 or more rushing touchdowns, and only 7 were able to notch 1,000 yards. In 2K16, 7 running backs had over 10 rushing touchdowns, and 12 running backs were able to pass 1,000 yards. In a season that relied so heavily on drafting high-end wide receivers, it seemed as though the key to success was acquiring a powerhouse back. But which powerhouse back is best? Is it the guy who set a record for 15 straight games with over 100 yards for scrimmage? Or is it the rookie who led the league in rushing? Or how about the man that 3 separate times ran for over 200 yards? The answer is neither of these gentlemen, but rather the Shadester himself, LeSean McCoy, aka the Slippery Fish. Don't believe me? Prepare to be proven wrong. LeSean McCoy was a true fantasy MVP this season and should be a key running back to focus on next season. Well, first I'm going to take his statistics for this year and get an average fantasy output per game and compare that to other elite running backs. So let's start with Shady's statistics for this year. LeSean McCoy had 1,267 rushing yards, 356 receiving yards, 13 rushing touchdowns, a receiving touchdown, and no fumbles lost. To get an average fantasy output per game, we just need to make a few simple calculations. First, we need to take a player's total receiving yards and total rushing yards and divide that by the amount of games that they played. This will give us an average yards per game for that player. To get average fantasy football points for yards per game, we simply need to divide this number by 10, because 10 yards is equivalent to 1 fantasy point. Then we need to account for touchdowns. By taking a player's total rushing touchdowns and total receiving touchdowns and dividing that by the amount of games played, we will get an average of touchdowns per game. To calculate average fantasy points per game from touchdowns, we need to multiply this number by 6, as touchdowns are worth 6 fantasy points. Thirdly, we need to take into account any fumbles lost. In Shady's case, he did not lose any fumbles, but if he did, you would need to take the number of fumbles lost divided by the number of games played, and multiply that number by -2, as this is the worth of fumbles lost in fantasy football. Finally, you need to add the 3 totals you got: average fantasy points per yards per game, average fantasy points from touchdowns per game, and then the average fantasy points of fumbles per game, and you will get your total of average fantasy points per game for that player. Now, I previously listed Shady's yardage total and touchdown totals, so now we need to figure out how many games Shady played. Now, in a typical football season, there are 17 weeks with a bye, meaning a typical running back participates for 16 games. However, that was not the case for Shady, because we need to take injuries into account. Week 8 versus the New England Patriots, McCoy sat out with a hamstring injury. But to say that LeSean McCoy participated in 15 games just because he started every game except Week 8 and his obvious bye week would be inaccurate. There are 3 separate times where LeSean McCoy participated in a game but had to leave because of injury and did not touch the ball more than 10 times. Before Week 8 and Week 7, LeSean McCoy was dealing with the same hamstring injury that plagued him in Week 8. And rather than sit him like a smart coach would do, Rex played him in Week 7, where he totaled 8 rushing attempts for 11 yards and then re-injured his hamstring, causing him to miss the following week. I think it's fair to admit Week 7 due to injury and not touching the ball more than 10 times. Also, in Week 17 against the Jets, LeSean McCoy had 5 rushing attempts for 10 yards before being injured and taken out of the game with a high ankle sprain. We will also be omitting this game from games played. Finally, if we go to Week 11 versus Cincinnati, LeSean McCoy is off to a good start with 5 rushing attempts for 33 yards, a touchdown, and 2 receptions for 12 yards. However, dislocated his thumb during this game and did not return. We will also be omitting this game because of the reasons I have stated previously of being injured and not touching the ball 10 or more times. Now we have a total games played of 12, which is still 75% of the season and a good number to work with. Now we need to make some adjustments to Shady's yardage and touchdown totals so they accurately represent the amount of games that he played, 12. By eliminating 11 yards from Week 7, 33 yards from Week 11, 10 yards from Week 17, 12 receiving yards from Week 11, and a touchdown from Week 11, we get Shady's new statistics, which are 1,213 rushing yards, 344 receiving yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, and still a receiving touchdown. Let's begin with our calculations. By adding Shady's total rushing and receiving yards together, we get 1,557 yards, and dividing that by 12, we get a total of 129.75 yards from scrimmage per game. To get the average fantasy points from yards per game, we will be dividing that number by 10, which will give us a total of 12.975 points per game. However, we will be rounding this number to 13. Now let's look at Shady's touchdowns. If we take his total amount of touchdowns, 13, and divide that by the games played, 12, we get 1.08333 repeating. And when we multiply that by 6, we get a total of 6.5 points per game from touchdowns. And when we add that to 13, our points from yards, we get a total of 19.5 fantasy points per game for LeSean McCoy. Now let's compare that number with a couple of other running backs. Let's look at Le'Veon Bell and Jay Ajayi. I picked these two because when we put them under the same circumstances as LeSean McCoy, their circumstances being healthy and touching the ball at least 10 times, Bell and Ajayi only participate in 12 games. Now obviously Bell missed the first 3 games for his suspension and did not participate in Week 17 because his team's playoff spot was solidified. Jay Ajayi in the beginning of the season was fighting for the starting job and did not start touching the ball 10 times or more until Week 5, bringing his total to 12. Now that we have 2 candidates who have played the same amount of games as LeSean McCoy, let's look at their statistics and compare it to our MVP. We'll start with Ajayi. After adjusting Ajayi's statistics to him only starting for 12 games, we get a total of 1,197 rushing yards, 107 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, and no fumbles lost. Now let's do Ajayi's calculations. Also, I'll be referring to average yards per game as YPG and average touchdowns per game as TPG, just so this isn't so repetitive. After doing some math, we find that Ajayi has 10 fantasy points YPG and 3.5 fantasy points TPG, for a grand total of 13.5 fantasy points per game. And this is the guy who had over 600 yards in 3 games. McCoy is miles ahead of him. Now let's compare McCoy's statistics to Bell's. The good thing about Bell's statistics is we don't have to do any readjusting since he didn't play for 4 games, so let's go ahead and dive right in. Bell had 1,268 rushing yards, 616 receiving yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 1 fumble lost. Let's do our calculations. We can see that Bell has 15.7 YPG, 4.5 TPG, and minus 0.1666 repeating for average fumbles lost per game, which gives him a grand total of 20.033. What? Let me check my notes. 20.33 is greater than 19.5. How can I make a video saying McCoy's the best when Bell is better? This just doesn't make sense. Oh wait, I forgot about something. When looking through McCoy's game-by-game data, you can see something that stands out. A slow start to the season, where in week 1 he only had 13 points and in week 2 he only had 9, and his numbers explode right after that game. Is that coincidence? I think not. After losing on the road in their first game versus Baltimore and getting embarrassed in their home opener versus the Jets, the Bills made a big change and they fired offensive coordinator Greg Roman. And guess who they replaced him with? Assistant head coach and running back coach Anthony Lynn. As soon as the Bills make this change, the numbers speak for themselves. LeSean McCoy skyrocketed in points. So let's make one more change to the criteria. Let's now only consider games where LeSean McCoy was healthy, touched the ball more than 10 times, and was under offensive coordinator Anthony Lynn. And this is completely fair criteria. To judge a running back on a game where he wasn't healthy or didn't touch the ball 10 or more times is unreasonable, and Anthony Lynn was the offensive coordinator for the Bills more than 87% of the season. It was the first 2 games that we're admitting, so it's completely fair, and let's move along with readjusting Shady's statistics. After the proper readjustments are made, we can see that Shady has a new total of 1,096 rushing yards, 301 receiving yards, 11 rushing touchdowns, and still a receiving touchdown. After our calculations, we find that Shady has 14 YPG and 7.2 TPG for a grand total of 21.2 average fantasy points per game. Boom! And that's better than Le'Veon Bell.
But what about Murray? What about Zeke the Freak? What about Blunt? LeGarrette Blunt? You didn't even consider any of those guys.
Okay, you're right. There were a couple guys I didn't include. So how about I compare LeSean McCoy to the elite of the elite? The guy with the most yards from scrimmage from any running back and the guy with the most total touchdowns, David Johnson. David Johnson finished this year with 1,239 rushing yards, 879 receiving yards, 16 rushing touchdowns, 4 receiving touchdowns, and 3 fumbles. Those are pretty amazing statistics, and will LeSean McCoy be able to topple it? Let's do some math and find out. David Johnson played all 16 weeks, however, sustained an injury early on in week 17 and left the game, so we need to do some readjustments to his statistics. After making the proper corrections, we can see that David Johnson has a YPG of 13.8 and a TPG of 8. However, we need to take into account his 3 fumbles. Once we do that, we get a grand total adding everything up of 21.4, 0.2 higher than LeSean McCoy. That's right, folks. After doing all the calculations, we can see that LeSean McCoy averages 0.2 less fantasy points per game than the guy who is nominated to be MVP of this season. And I'm not trying to knock David Johnson at all. All I'm saying is I don't think people realize how insane McCoy did this year, and not enough people care. Now, I know there are going to be some people who disagree that my criteria is fair and say that I shouldn't be able to judge Shady off 10 games and everyone else off all the games that they played. So I decided to do something just for fun. I took the top 10 running backs for rushing this year and eliminated their worst 6 performances of the season, therefore having everyone at an equal 10 games played, and did the same calculations. Let's see where everyone finishes. Once again, this was just for fun. I'm not going to actually try to prove anything with this data, I just thought it would be fun to look at. And I think it's important to bring up, there is a reason why we're eliminating McCoy's games. It makes sense to eliminate his games based on his offensive coordinator. But for other running backs, it wouldn't make sense to get rid of random games just because. There's no reason behind it. Anyway, was I able to prove that LeSean McCoy was the true MVP this season? I think so. He didn't technically have the most average fantasy points per game, but he was pretty darn close. but Shady's performance gets overshadowed by all the different narratives. No one is going to remember how well Shady did when they could look at how historic David Johnson's season was this year. Or look back at the two rookie sensations, Ezekiel Elliott and Jordan Howard, who finished as top 3 running backs in rushing. Or look back on how Le'Veon Bell came back from a suspension, surpassed 1,000 rushing yards and 500 receiving yards, and helped his team to the playoffs. How about Jay Ajayi with his 3 200-yard performances? Or even LeGarrette Blount, who led the league in rushing touchdowns with 18. That's not to mention by the time next season comes around, big names that did poorly this year still might be hyped up, such as Lamar Miller and Todd Gurley. Heck, people might even draft Devonta Freeman before they draft McCoy. My main point is to silence all the other narratives and see McCoy for what he really is. Fantasy gold, a true MVP that brought many people championships and should be drafted as a top 3 guy next year. So my little Stainers, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope all of you know who the true MVP is.